Well, should we get the show on the road?
I think we should.
So, welcome to MentorCore's event with the amazing Matt Kelly. We are so excited to have Matt here today. First of all, because you're such a thought leader in the compliance, ethics, audit, governance space. And also because you're just a lot of fun. My name is Lisa Beth Lentini Walker, and I am one of the co-founders of MentorCore, where we bring compliance, ethics, security, privacy, risk professionals together to talk about careers and professional development and what we see as the future in this space. And I'm so excited because I get to do all of this work with my buddy Dan. Dan, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Ayala, also co-founder of MentorCore, and I'm really excited to have Matt here today. The future is always something we think about and talk about, and being able to put some of those thoughts into words is really neat as we start to approach the end of what's been quite the year. Matt, welcome.
Hi, uh, happy to be here with you both. Thank you.
Thanks. It's great to have you.
So, Matt, you are the editor for Radical Compliance. Tell us just a little bit about Radical Compliance and what brought you along your journey to where you are today.
Sure. So Radical Compliance is a newsletter and blog I publish myself. It's just me, and I've been doing that since the start of 2016, so just about 5 years or so. And before that, I was the editor of Compliance Week for 10 years. And before that, I was a writer at Compliance Week for 2 years. So in one form or another, I've been writing about corporate compliance or governance or risk management, corporate internal audit. I define that very broadly, but I've been writing about these things since the start of probably 2003, right after the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed. Um, these days, Radical Compliance in particular, it is comes out every Friday afternoon. It is one part news that has happened this week, just that compliance and audit professionals might want to be aware of, and one part some analysis of that news to more take some lessons about what did this thing that happened, whether that was a regulatory adoption or an enforcement action or just something in the news, what about this thing that happened would be relevant to compliance officers from here forward. Um, so, for example, a couple of weeks ago, Citibank was fined by banking regulators $400 million for having some very poor compliance and risk management practices. And I went nuts on that and turned out 4 pieces about what is actually in those consent orders that other compliance officers could use to build your own risk management processes. Um, the other thing that I do with Radical Compliance is every Friday I publish the jobs report.
One of
And
my favorite parts of it, like it's a
thank
must
you.
read.
Uh, all that is really is just news I have gathered from either people updating their LinkedIn profiles or things I see in press releases about who has taken what job, who has been promoted, who has left their role to be a consultant, who's hit a work milestone. I try to find a few interesting compliance or risk management jobs that are currently open and other gossip, things like that. So everybody who's on the call today and you wondering, like, who are the dorks who really obsess over LinkedIn and all of these posts I make? I am that dork. That is me. I am a power dork when it comes to LinkedIn. And so if you ever have news or you're looking for anything along those lines, you can help. But compliance.
We may have annoyed
Like
his
it froze.
ISP.
I'm back.
He's back. So one of the things that everybody who is listening in today should do, if you haven't already, sign up to get the Radical Compliance updates. They're fantastic. They are my must read every week. One of my favorite parts beyond the jobs, which is always kind of interesting to see who's moving and shaking, is the compliance memes.
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah, I try to inject some humor into this compliance profession. If anybody listening has an idea for a funny meme about compliance, please feel free to send that to me. My newsletter comes out every Friday late morning, and you have no idea where it's like, it's 10:35, and I'm thinking, oh, geez, I still need a meme, and I'm scrambling. Sometimes they're great. Some people have told me that they are unfunny occasionally, but they appreciate the attempt. So if you have a funny meme about this, you want it to become famous, send it in to me. I'll drop it in the newsletter. And the newsletter's free.
Terrific. It's a fantastic news source. It is one of my must reads each week. So, yet another reason why we're very excited that you're sharing with us today. So, we're going to talk predictions
Sure.
because in a world of uncertainty, one thing that we can do that likely will not actually yield any productive fruit, but is still interesting to talk about, is to talk about what the future might hold. Um, so there's been a lot going on right now with this pandemic. Um,
Mhm.
what have you seen and heard, and what are you seeing in terms of trends, both in the compliance space, audit, risk management, all of those areas? We know there's a lot going on with cybersecurity right now, too. What do you see?
So what I see today is different than what I did see in March and April, where I was talking with a lot of audit committee members back then about how they were trying to respond to the pandemic. And when I was doing some research for articles then, the audience for that were internal auditors and risk managers, not compliance officers, but there was still a lot, I think, that was very relevant for all of these professions, that the audit committees and the boards are very uneasy that they do not understand the true picture of what's really going on in the business they run. So a lot of fears about we have our risk assessment, our understanding of risk has clearly needs to be updated because nobody had a pandemic plan back in January. Nobody was thinking global pandemic should be in our risk management plan. Um, so they're worried a lot about how can we perform a new risk assessment to understand what's really going on and give we on the board an accurate picture of what data do we need to know about? Are we getting that data in a timely way so we can understand the better questions to ask and the more important decisions to make? Um, I mean, it's hard because on one hand, here I am saying that you need to be much more versatile in risk assessment. At the same time, we're all working from home. So the actual mechanics of doing a risk assessment have changed dramatically.
Mhm.
Um, I'm unclear on if that is, in some ways, it's for the worse, in some ways, it's better. I actually have heard some people say that doing like a walkthrough of a compliance process or a risk control process, doing a walkthrough by Zoom with somebody in Japan in your Far East office where you can just literally peer right at their computer screen as they're talking, like, well, that's not so bad. It's much cheaper and less of a hassle than actually flying over to the Asia Pacific region for 2 weeks. So in some ways, that's good. In a lot of ways, though, what we had was this gigantic, sudden public health risk that the enterprise had to react to and reacted by saying, everybody work from home if you can, take your laptops, we'll figure it out later. And they had no idea what later was, and they had no idea what all the implications were for everybody rush home. So, yes, there's that stereotype of board meetings that were happening by Zoom.
Mhm.
And one audit committee member, he phrased it to me really well. He's like, did I ever talk to other audit committee members by Zoom last year? He's like, yeah, sure we did. To like ask where we're going to get dinner or to say, I need to call you because it's changed. The other two, much better. It's catch up. That's what's happened. I'll have one other big point that I wanted to call out. The other thing that has surprised me is that people ask, what is the compliance job market like right now? If I can get away with saying this, the market is really bad and really good at the same time, because there's a lot of people who have lost their jobs. A lot of really good senior compliance people at large companies have lost their jobs. At the same time, there's a lot of hiring that's going on. And there are a lot of companies that are telling me, we're having a bitch of a time trying to find just this right person. And it's unusual to be able to say, to have to say that both extremes are true at the same time. But like, I can remember in March when the shutdowns just happened, I was convinced I'd have to scale that jobs report back to like once a month, and I haven't. And three of the five largest reports I've ever put out, and I've been doing this for 4.5 years, three of the five biggest have all come over the summer. Um, so I'm not sure how much is that I know more about what's going on. How much is it just that there's more activity? I don't know. But if the job market only sucked, I would not have that report coming out every week. And I do. I know it sucks if it happens to you. And I think in some ways it is still going to suck for a while. But in other ways, it's also going to be not that bad. And that was a big surprise to me.
Yeah, we're seeing this in the security world too. It's opportunism.
Yeah.
Opportunism to make the changes organizationally that you've wanted to make for a long time, knowing that there are people out there that are looking, that want to come in too. And so boards are taking this moment to make those changes. Not always in line with what we as practitioners might expect or advise, but it's definitely an opportunistic time.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
don't know, are you seeing, you just to jump back to your risk assessment comment,
Yeah.
putting pandemics into your risk assessment, it almost feels a little reactionary, and it should be done, but almost like, after the shoe bomber, everybody went to look for shoes at the airport.
Mm-hmm.
Are you seeing a trend in which people are widening that view to look more closely and more realistically at other material risks beyond pandemics? Or is it pretty narrow focused around, we've got a pandemic, let's just focus on the risks of the pandemic and, like
Well,
you
it's
said, do the
more
rest
like,
later?
how is the pandemic affecting the risks that we already have? And I carved it up into two clumps. There are a few risks we've never had before that the pandemic has created, and we can get to those. But for a lot of it, these are risks we've all had before for many years, but operating a pandemic changes what those risks are, sometimes radically. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. Let's say you are a manufacturer of plastic components.
Mm-hmm.
Boring business, pays the bills, but it's low margin, unsexy, whatever. And boom, the governor in your state has had to shut down the factory. Well, you decide as a maker of plastics, I'm going to start making face shields because A, now I am an essential manufacturer, I can reopen, and B, everybody needs a face shield. We've got a shortage of PPE in this country. I'm going to make a boatload. Sounds simple. But number one, if you are now making PPE for hospital systems, local governments, and whatnot, well, now you're a government contractor.
Right.
And if you have not had experience as a government contractor, you have a bevy of compliance risks coming along that you may have never considered before.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing, we'll get back to fraud risk, is who was stealing plastic components in 2019? Nobody. It's a boring job. But what would your risk then be of somebody in the loading bay moving plastic face shields off the back of the truck to sell in the black market? Like, that's bizarre. And if you're just making boring components, you'd never have to think about that.
Right.
But now you've said, oh, great opportunity here to make plastic face shields, but your fraud risks are suddenly very different. And it's not financial fraud, it's actual theft of assets. And if you are an audit or compliance or corporate accounting person trying to figure out how do we do that, like, that's what when I say the risk assessment skills have to be really sharp, because
Yeah.
for many businesses, it might seem like there are opportunities, but what experience do we have with this kind of risk now? It's radically transformed. Um, Boards have often talked to me about, say, acquiring rivals on the cheap because somebody doesn't have good cash position and now they're on life support. We're going to grab an M&A deal and be ready to come out in 2021 like gangbusters. Again, great idea, but you yourself as a business in that position, looking to be the acquirer, what's your liquidity risk management? What is your approval process for spending on expenditures just generally? So to be sure that when you find that vulnerable target on the cheap, you actually have the cash to go and buy them. Um, these are new questions or old questions asked in new ways, I would put it. And for a lot of compliance officers, I think that can be challenging and interesting, but we need to be aware that some of these questions we have to answer. You've never really had to ask them before. So how do you navigate that?
Right. So following on to that, what you said, um, you said that there were some risks and questions that were created by the pandemic.
Yes.
I know that there have been different movements of goods. For example, I know that there's been a lot more drug activity that's been going through things like, um, delivery services, et cetera. Tell me a little bit more about what types of risks you're seeing that were created by the pandemic.
Well, I focus mostly on just the actual public health risks of trying to conduct business with an infectious disease running rampant in the country. And some of that, if you are some sort of essential business or manufacturer where people have no choice but to be physically present, you have to think about things like health and safety concerns at a new level of magnitude. We saw this with the meatpacking industry earlier this spring, where they were some of the worst COVID hotspots in the country for the first couple of months. But bringing everybody in where they were supposed to work together at close quarters, but social distancing would say that you can't. So how would you actually do this? And could you put plastic plexiglass shielding in between everybody? Could you replace some of the bathrooms with touchless hand sanitizer stations? Really nuts and bolts environmental health and safety issues that, as a concept, that's not news, but applied to infectious disease, like we really haven't had to think about it. The
Right.
other big compliance risk that I think COVID brings is for professional services, white collar firms and whatnot. You're going to have to think a lot more about the implications of mass work from home for many months on end. And while I don't have a good answer to these other questions, we will next year have to start thinking about how do we bring employees back to the office? Can you actually require people to get vaccinated? If they do get vaccinated, can you demand that they tell you that they have? Would they be able to demand that, no, I'm not going to come into the office. You have to accommodate me working from home. Um, what about if employees getting tested, and can they get tested? Can you require them to get tested? What happens with the positive test? What happens here in the United States versus your German or French operations where the privacy risks are up to here? I'm not an employment lawyer, so I don't have those answers off the top of my head. I suspect many employment lawyers don't have the answers either because we've
Right.
never had to think about this before. But we could go on and on about all of these compliance risks and the new ways that we are working, driven by an infectious disease that is either keeping us all apart or in real world critical infrastructure, still bringing people together, but now we have to prevent the virus from jumping back and forth. That's the sort of stuff that COVID is turning us into knots.
Yeah, and I can confirm you're right. I'm deep into those employment law discussions, and they're not. There's nothing concrete about them,
No.
even within one jurisdiction. And the other thing to think about too is the material change in how businesses operate, how people staff.
Yep.
Whereas geographically clustered, even if not in the same the same physical location, is going to stop. You're going to have people in potentially all 50 states, whereas they were all in one place previously.
Yeah.
It becomes a really interesting set of both controls and requirements.
And
I
I think
mean,
that may be partially why you're seeing so much frothiness too in the hiring market, is hiring's being done differently.
Yeah. Oh, it
mhm.
opened new avenues have been opened up, wide new avenues that had never been pursuable or perceived to be pursuable before. So let's go check them out and see what we can, take them out for a spin and see what they can do.
I mean, I've seen positions now that are being advertised as director of remote working. And I mean, I know that's HR, not compliance and audit like we all here are, but my first thought was like, how do you write the job description for that? How do they even know what that job should be? Would you want to take it knowing that probably by 2022, that job hopefully will not be in existence anymore? All sorts of ways that we are being challenged. Um, I mean, on a practical level, what becomes more important then? And that's always a question I ask. What becomes more important to be able to do given the changing circumstances? You have to be really on top of regulatory change. And, Dan, when you're talking about employees working in all 50 states, that is 50 different tax
Oh
jurisdictions with
yeah.
50
And they
opinions.
may not
And
be telling you that they've
right
moved to those
there,
states.
yes. Workman's comp rules and retaliation and harassment. So I live in Massachusetts, and our big thing right now is our state is trying to tax New Hampshire residents who previously would cross the border to work in
Mhm.
Massachusetts. But now you're supposed to pay state income tax, even though you're working for a company that isn't based in Massachusetts, did have a plant in Massachusetts. The plant is closed. So you're working in New Hampshire, you're living in New Hampshire. And we're now saying you still have a nexus, I guess, conceptually, because you were here, last year. So we're just going to decide you're subject to income tax. That's going to
New
go right up
Hampshire's
to the
going to
Supreme
decide the
Court.
same thing.
It's the head.
They
I believe the
are,
head
yes.
tax.
So there's this bizarre standoff. They're going to encircle us with toll roads in response, I think. But how are you, the corporate attorney, the HR person, the compliance officer? How are you supposed to handle this? There is no idea what to do about things like that. But we're
Mhm.
just two examples. Whatever 50 times 50 is, that's the number of potential scenarios. So that's the sort of frothiness that we're talking about, Lisa Beth. I love that word.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of my favorite word right now because it sounds less obnoxious than some of the other like new normal and all this other stuff. But talking about how things have been just kind of in a state of flux,
Yeah.
um, moving forward, what kinds of skills and capabilities do you think are going to be important? Not, I mean, just in general, but also to the profession.
Yeah.
How with this, we've leapfrogged from a virtual world perspective and changed almost overnight and moved forward. I think probably what would have taken 3 to 5 years. What do you
Yeah.
see right now?
So this is something that's been on my mind long before the pandemic, something that I saw coming that actually I think originates from the internal audit world,
Hmm.
where if you asked board directors, what do they need? What do they worry about that they want help with from the internal auditors? They would give two answers. They'd say, number one, we want better understanding of emerging risks, and we want the internal audit to tell us when a risk is emerging. Number two, we want more real-time analysis of what these risks are. We want to build data analytics that help us assess a business process and all the transactions there are the raw material to study it. And we want analytics that will help us more quickly identify when something in that business process has transgressed into the red zone and it needs attention so that it can be escalated to the board right away. That's what the board wants. And they say, and internal audit works for us, so you guys have to do it. Internal audit is fine with that. But if you think about what they are trying to do, they're trying to use data technology and better algorithms, and internal audit can do this. They're very skilled at it, to build analytical tools that will monitor a business process and detect anomalous events.
Mhm.
Historically, that audit would have happened once a year, better technology once a quarter. With an automatic algorithm, you can just have it essentially auditing the business process day and night, every day, and then audit would give it to the business unit leader to say, go forth and self-monitor. When it gets weird, call me, or I'll be back in a year to see how you're doing. Someone explain to me the difference between that I've just set out and the compliance officer's imperative to get everybody to behave a certain way. Because what that really means is get everybody to follow business processes a certain way rather than misbehave and cause some anomalous event to drift into the red zone. And we spend so much time in compliance testing and monitoring to do what? To find that transaction when it gets into the red zone. I have always wondered for several years now, it seemed to me that audit and compliance were approaching a convergence point from opposite directions. And I had thought that would be something that would evolve throughout the 2020s. I didn't know what the final answer might look like. I don't want to say something like there can be only one and somebody gets voted off the island. But whatever that convergence was going to be over the 2020s, now it's more like convergence by the Halloween. Because the pandemic made boards aware of just how out of position they were on risk assessment and emerging risks. And like,
Right.
we got to get much better at this. So like, I don't know what the career path would be. I know some large organizations where they have consolidated compliance and audit into a office of integrity that oversees both. I could envision a world where there is a souped up chief risk management function that addresses compliance risk and identifies emerging risks. And then you kick training back to the HR function and legal takes a lot more. But where's audit in that? Where's compliance in that? Where's the ethics part in that? I'm not entirely sure, but I can tell you where the CFO is. CFO is going to be looking at all these pieces getting closer and closer together with their budget cutting scalpel, and they're ready to start. And you have to start thinking through, where's my protection? And maybe we can talk about that. But like, that's the big broad dynamic I see, is that I don't want to say audit and compliance are converging. In some sectors that will not happen. In banking, that will not happen. But in many other industries, where it's really about monitoring for anti-corruption risks and faulty transactions and weak accounting policies, it could happen. People have done crazier things and made it work. So I think a lot about the future of both professions. Like, I don't know if they are converging, they're just going to be very parallel and close to each other, but that's where I see things going. And then you have to start thinking about, what are my career development skills and responses to that?
Well, and I know Dan and I have had a lot of conversations about how close security and
Yep.
privacy and compliance continue to become, right? It used to be that Dan was the side of the tech folks, and
Mhm.
and cybersecurity was a tech
The
issue.
tech
It's
side,
really a
right.
people issue, right? Um, but all of those different areas seem to be overlapping in new and different ways. And we've talked about the importance of collaboration versus siloing, and now we're bringing in the data analytics folks too. So I think that you're onto something that who knows how it will turn out, but there is some level of convergence going on,
Yeah.
and there will be ways that people want to cut, change the dynamic, etc., in the next couple of probably months, not years.
I mean, I could even give you an example that somebody has told me. And Dan, since you're in security, I'd love to get your reaction to this. But it was a regulatory compliance VP at a large investment bank who goes around saying that anti-money laundering compliance and cybersecurity should be integrated at large financial firms, because fundamentally it is about identifying somebody's on your network doing something weird, and I need to know about that. How they got into the network, because they used false credentials or they passed themselves off as a customer when they're not, like, that's not ideal that they got in, and we should figure it out. But whether you're in AML or you're in cybersecurity, the bigger problem is, don't let them out. Don't let them take whatever they're taking out the door, whether that's
Mhm.
financial data or cybersecurity. Whether it's money or whether it's data, it's just ones and zeros in the modern
Mhm.
corporation. So you have to stop them. And he goes around saying that AML and cybersecurity are essentially the same thing at very large corporations. And I remember the first time he told me that, I thought, that's absolutely crazy, except it's not. It's
It's
really
not.
sharp.
And I'll
And
tell you, 20 years ago, I was in banking at the time, and we were doing exactly that. The first AML systems that we were putting in, were doing exactly that. And they were following security. They were following the kinds of methodologies of detect, contain,
Mhm.
respond, and eradicate that we've been practicing in information security for quite some time. And it wasn't right. It wasn't about the prevention. It was about an efficient detection and response.
Yeah.
So it's not quite as crazy. At first, like you said, I bucked when you first said it, but no, it actually does. It actually does make a lot of sense. And the convergences you mentioned earlier, um,
Mhm.
are mimicking what we've experienced on the security and risk side, as security has turned into more of a technology risk management mindset and data
Yeah.
protection mindset versus privacy. All of those kinds of convergences around repeatable process automation, the data science. I think that anyone who's in this field that wants to guarantee their future, go look at the data science of it, and you will be employable for the next epoch.
Yeah.
Um, because it's all about the numbers.
And you know what intrigues me is that really, whether we're talking about AML or cybersecurity, the trick here is that you need to know what is normal for
Mhm.
this particular person on your enterprise.
Yep.
And when they're doing something that is abnormal. And stated another way, you need to build a risk profile, which is something that compliance officers and financial services have to do all the time. That is like FINRA and the Fed and OCC and everybody else. They all scream about build risk profiles for your customers. So if we want to talk about what are the skills that become more important in this kind of a future that is rapidly becoming the present, you would have to think through how would an industry, how would a large organization sharpen its risk profile building abilities?
Mhm.
And does that require you to go back to school and get a data science degree? I don't think so. I think that's probably would be great if you can afford to do it. Many people can't, but when you have to think through, like, what are the skills, what are the capabilities a compliance program will need? That's the key question to ask. The risk profile is just an example of it. We could come up with some others,
Mhm.
but that's where career security lies, in being able to see that's the right question and then have good answers to it.
Yep.
It's so funny because we had earlier this month, Bill Hoffman, who's a data analyst and was the chief data officer for Best Buy and for US Bank. And he was with the CIA and with McKinsey. And one of his big points was data analytics is only as good as asking the right question.
Yeah.
And, to your point, finding the right risk profile, asking the right questions consistently is one of those skills that's kind of built over time, but it is one of the skills that seems to be in high demand for the future.
Hmm.
The other thing that I heard you saying was, um, we should be learning from each other because, security has risk methodologies and they've got structures in place. The governance behind how you consistently and kind of adequately put together these programs seems to be another area that is growing in demand.
Yeah. I definitely think that there's a lot around, like, the government is clearly emphasizing cybersecurity risks up and down. If you're a defense contractor now, you already have DFARS compliance, where you need to establish strong cybersecurity in your own operation, down the food chain to your suppliers. Um,
With
it
no
almost sounds
exceptions
like
allowed.
compliance officers. This is anti-corruption all over again,
Mhm.
sub-certifying your tier 2, tier 3 people. It's just cross out corruption, put in cyber, and it's the same objective. Um, how you would actually get that done is going to be challenging. I will say that I'm very impressed with the NIST agency in the government for churning out all sorts of very good frameworks. So if you are a security specialist and you're looking to figure out what should I actually do, going through the NIST framework is not my idea of a fun time. It's hundreds of pages long, but it's very exacting, and there are clear roadmaps there. Contrast that to FCPA compliance, where the Justice Department has given us about 19 pages on an effective compliance program, and the FCPA resource guide is 120 pages, and everybody is supposed to do something from that. NIST gives you regular framework updates like every year in multiple subjects. There's plenty of raw material there. The other big skill that I wanted to talk about that I think will be more important is the risk assurance professional, whether you are in compliance in the second line of defense, you're in internal audit in the third line, or in your security, or whoever you are, um, getting to know how the business works in the first line of defense. And we have
Yes.
always said this, like 10 years ago, the Institute of Internal Auditors yelled at me because I had a headline I wrote, IIA says auditors need people skills. But it was 10 years ago, and they were right then.
And it's still true
It's true
today.
today.
Let's hope they listen.
But whether we say you have to know the business or you have to have good people skills or anything else, it is that ability to work with the first line of defense business units, so that they actually will treat you with respect and give you the attention that you need and deserve. And that they will want to work with you because you do have a lot that you could offer to them for better governance of their own operations. Um, but if it is still at your organization the case that business does the business thing and then compliance comes in at the end, like that's not going to work. Um, Compliance has to really be much more interoperating and cooperative. Not to bend over backwards. I'm not saying you have to give the first line what they want, but you have to understand their needs and sort of, in a certain sense, they're your customers, and you have to meet your customers where they are because your customers are not going to bother with you. If you make compliance or security a big pain in the neck, they will make it their mission in life to figure out some way to evade you. And I know this
Always
because
find
I
its
once
way.
had a new travel reimbursement policy come down from corporate, and I hated it. And I spent a day trying to figure out how could I cheat this system to get the seat I wanted on an airline that I wanted to fly on. And I was editor of Compliance Week, writing about how you should not do that. And I did that for 6 hours one day, trying to figure out how I could still get on JetBlue, not a preferred airline for my new company. Everybody does it, and you have to make accommodations to that reality.
That's
I'm only
probably the
laughing
most
because
real we've heard so far. and I can totally understand it. Totally understand it.
if you
Yep.
search for a flight between this window of 2 minutes in which there's only one flight, then it will work. But
Yes, that was exactly the program that they laid down. But seriously, they did everything wrong because it was just given to us from the corporate controller. We had no idea this was coming. We had no idea how to make it work. He didn't know that JetBlue was the biggest airline in Boston, where we were, and that's the airline I'd have to fly, but it was not on the preferred vendor list. So it took me 6 hours. I finally figured out some way to short circuit it, and then I wrote about it, and then suddenly they realized they should be more accommodating.
yeah,
That's fantastic.
I love. I mean, you're
After the VP threatened to fire me.
well, of course. I mean, the idea of this being tied to business, I think, is so vastly important. Our roles exist at the behest of the businesses we serve, and helping them do the best business they can, and finding the middle ground that balances business and risk it teaches them to think that way too.
Yeah. I mean, people forget, or hopefully other people forget, compliance officers, I hope that they know this, that most employees actually do want to do the right thing by the company. And Ethisphere, they put out surveys on a regular basis talking about why people do report misconduct to the compliance function. And the number one thing is because it's the right thing to do, and I want the company to fix the problem. And that people should be doing handsprings over that answer. There is a sincere interest among employees that they do want to do the right thing. And most of them, when they are violating the policy or something, they're often thinking, I'm doing this in the best interest of the company. I spent the 6 hours trying to get that JetBlue flight because JetBlue was going to be the cheapest, easiest way for me to make a business trip. And I sincerely believed, and I still do today, that spending 6 hours finding a way to violate company policy was in the company's best interests. The company could have been a bit more forward thinking about how to develop a policy and work with me in the first line of defense in my own organization. They could have done that. And most companies, if they take that approach, will really do themselves a lot of favors.
So, everybody likes to talk about how compliance professionals or security professionals or any of the guardians, I like to call them the guardians because I think that's what we really do. We put controls in place and we help people make better decisions. Um, but we always talk about how people get a seat at the table,
Mhm.
with management, with the board. Um, what do you think the best way is to go about this in this new environment? I've seen people saying, hey, um, it's only the ELT. Only the ELT gets to talk about this stuff, and they're missing input. What What are your thoughts on that, and what are you seeing out in the market?
Well, so if you are skilled at talking with the business and working with the business and knowing how the business runs, and you still do have a good sense of what compliance risks are and how you can improve business processes and whatnot, then you could do what one audit committee member, she told me, I was asking her back in April, like, what could internal audit do to get a better seat at the table in these calamitous times? And she basically said, help me figure out ways to make more money at this company. Because this was in April. She's like, I have been, the game I play is how to survive in business. And right now, my company is up against the most fearsome opponent we have ever seen. And it was a really arresting comment that she made to me. But it goes back to what I said way back at the beginning. Boards are terrified that they don't understand what's really happening at the company and they're missing something. Maybe they're missing some risk that needs attention, but they're also afraid that they are missing some way to get a strategic advantage. So if you are astute in helping the board figure that out, if you're really good at data analytics, could you find some new customer segment through marketing analysis that would help them sell a new product or sell more product to a new person or new audience, especially these days when selling could be very difficult. But if you could help find that, suddenly you will be amazed that management or the audit committee would say, oh, wow, it so happens there's a seat right next to me. Come down and come sit. Um,
Right.
But be
it's
careful
going to
with
be
the
all about
capacity.
how to help them do their jobs better. Sometimes that will be helping them save money. It will be maybe helping them grow in a prudent but effective way. It will be helping them to avoid falling into a trap that's right in front of them. Um, but above all, if look, if you can help them solidify cash flows, you'd be amazed at how nice that seat right next to them is going to be and how quickly that seat is available. Um, Internal audit might be better at that than others. Security probably could help with some of that. Compliance, it's hit or miss because compliance, look, it is usually going to be a cost center. I still believe if compliance runs very well over the long term, the business will be much better off and much a more resilient and able to grow even under difficult business conditions. Um, Fundamentally, I say that what boards want to do is focus on the long term. They want to grow, they want to execute on their plans. What do they actually do? They clean up all the messes that are preventing them from doing what they want to do, and that's true in the board and that's true in senior management. They have these great huge ambitions and then we suddenly get sued because we weren't thinking about some risk that we blundered into. So prudent awareness of compliance that prevents that lawsuit. Now you're not getting sued. Now you don't have this tactical distraction. You can still focus on the strategy. That's what senior managers and board directors like to do. So compliance can help with that. Um, the other big metaphor that I like to come up with is that a good compliance program is a lot like going to the gym. If you go to the gym regularly over the long course of your life, you're going to feel great and live longer, and you're going to be healthier. And whatever happens to you, you will recover from it more quickly. You do not feel good the first time you go to the gym and you build that compliance program. You feel like you've been hit by a truck. And a lot of companies do the first time they do that compliance risk assessment, like, oh God, we got to rip everything up. But after that, you will eventually become a much more resilient organization. That is exactly what we saw with SOX compliance the first time it happened in the mid 2000s. Total nightmare. Nobody liked it. These days, SOX compliance is nobody's idea of a good time, but neither is eating spinach. Spinach is good for you, and you get on with your life.
So one of the things, just to pivot on that, is the idea of people are buying. One of the things we found in the security and privacy world is people are buying more and more based on aligned ethics and the
Yeah.
percept corporate ethics, and the visibility of those things. So we're seeing things like security and privacy and ethics and compliance be business differentiators. And this is one of the things that's been an interesting evolution, is using these things and to help companies. It actually helps top line sales in a way that we're in fields we
Totally.
never thought we'd be beyond cost centers, but we're in a time in which we can
Mhm.
actually do that.
And I think that a big reason for that is the rise of social media.
Mhm.
Um, People talk about social media risk. I reject that. I don't think social media for many businesses is a risk unto itself. Social media magnifies the risks you already have. And you want to talk about visibility into your corporate conduct and ethics and your morals. Well, social media is just a gigantic magnifying glass for that. And any misstep can be brutally dissected on social media,
Right.
not necessarily fairly or even accurately. We will all be surprised to know that some things on social media are not true, but nonetheless, they're out there. And you have to respond to them. And the example I gave 3 minutes ago about, you get sued and you're distracted, that is a walk in the park compared to a social media flare up that nobody is expecting. And suddenly the board is flipping out on a Sunday afternoon to get something that blew up on Twitter. And that's how you're going to spend your Monday morning. The more visible your moral ethics and priorities are as a business, the more people can see it. And the better you are at standing up with them, the better received you're going to be, and the less likely you will have these um, other stakeholders trying to hold your business accountable to their standards rather than yours. And social media makes that really easy to do. And that's why I think that's where the ethics component and good conduct, where do they matter? Like, that's where it matters, because social media will let people encircle you with their own code of accountability that they're going to try and apply to you.
Mhm.
I think
So
that's all the corny metaphors I have in my toolbox, by the way.
so one more question that I had that occurred to me is, right now, one of the hot topics beyond ESG is culture.
Yeah.
Culture is kind of the key word, and everybody wants to own culture, kind of, but nobody wants to necessarily be responsible for it.
Right.
So what are you seeing as the big culture shift that's going on, where it seems like there's a battlegrounds between HR and legal and compliance and ethics and DE and I? Where are you seeing that end up?
Um, I don't know, because I think we are still struggling to be able to assess and audit workplace culture in an effective way. Um, Not long ago, I was giving a talk to a group of internal auditors who wanted to know how to audit culture. And I would contend that you can't actually audit culture. You can audit those things that are affected by or manifestations of culture. And that will tell you what the culture probably is. But you're very much trying to reverse engineer or deduce what your culture is based on auditing and looking at other things. Quit rates, employee exit interviews, employee turnover generally, calls to the hotline, like, are they instructive about corporate culture? Kind of, but I would actually say you have to be more granular, like calls specifically about retaliation, and where's the retaliation happening, at what level, about what, how often, what's the historical norm for retaliation complaints. And getting that will tell you much more about corporate culture than, say, an employee survey, or just the fact that you have a lot of hotline calls, so people are speaking up. I mean, that's part of the culture and that's good, but speaking up about what, and
Mhm.
specifically, what are the implications of whatever they're talking about? And if it's retaliation, there's a lot of implications there about your training doesn't work, your corporate culture doesn't work, your management incentives might be off, and you can start to adjust it. Um, but trying to get your arms around corporate culture and adjust it and steer it in the way you want, I think that is a painstaking thing. And I haven't even gotten into diversity and inclusion, which I do think is really important. And even if you don't think it's important, first, I think most executives do. Um, the greater question here is who cares what you think, executive, because other people think it's important.
Right.
You have to go where your stakeholders are. Your employees, your investors, your consumers, the public, they think it's important. And if you don't address it, they will form alliances. And like I said, they will encircle you with their own expectations on
Mhm.
accountability. So you have to think about it. But I don't have a good answer for, how do you actually assess corporate culture? It's a very complex thing to do. I'd like to say HR and compliance and audit should work together to do it. That's like putting three cats into one stack and see how they all play together. Sometimes it can
I
be
would
very
have to
difficult,
agree.
but that's, you know,
You weren't out of analogies yet.
yeah.
You weren't quite out of analogies. Now maybe you are, but that was a good one.
All right.
So there's a couple of questions that have come in too that I want to ask. And the first one is around in cases where the company's trying to bring in some innovation, does the product
Yeah.
development team also bring in a compliance person to calibrate the compliance scenario they might be stepping into with these new developments? Or do you wait until after the product is decided and then bring compliance around to take a look at it? So it's a cart, horse, chicken, egg question relation to new product development, and when is the right time for compliance to step in?
Well, I mean, so you specifically asked, does product development do that? No, not often enough. Should they do it? Yes. And in fact, that's interesting that you bring that up because um, not long ago, the banking regulators hammered Citibank for very poor internal risk management and compliance procedures. And one of the things that they directed Citibank to do to improve its risk management program was come up with a process to assure that in organizational change, compliance and risk management is anticipated there. Um, the bank regulators were very clear that this is a big deal. Please do not screw this up. And here's a $400 million fine to help focus your mind on that point. I think that is a very good, it's a very high level example, but compliance and audit absolutely should be brought in. Product development is probably not doing a bad thing. Their heart is in the right place. Um, McDonald's, actually, they were a very good example of this too. So I once talked with the compliance and the audit executives who tag teamed their governance of social media. And McDonald's for a long time has been a huge player in social media. Their approach was always when we're doing something new, you call us up both and we will investigate and weigh in on what it is. Once we know what it is, then yes, you, the franchisee or the regional vice president, you go ahead and go forth, knock yourselves out. Nobody does anything new without telling us. But once we understand what the new is, then you don't need permission. You can just go and you can do it.
You define it
There's a
as a
lot of
path.
good.
You define
Yeah.
compliance as a path, as a step along the path toward a new product development. Somewhere along the way, and earlier is better than later.
Yeah. And I mean, if McDonald's was doing that 10 years ago and the Fed is just telling Citibank to do it now, clearly it's an important principle that fits across a wide range of industries.
Okay. Great, thanks. And we're getting close to the end of the time. And one of the things we do at the end of all of our all of our events is ask our guest a question. And the question is, Matt, what's the best advice that you ever got from a mentor you've had?
Oh boy. Other than my great editor many years ago when I was a newspaper reporter who said, show up on time, because he forgot to tell me what time my job was. And the first day as a newspaper reporter, I was 2 hours late. But no, he actually did say, and I think there's a lot of sense in this, try and figure out what the customers will want 6 months from now. And then ask yourself, what will they absolutely insist that you deliver 18 months from now? Then go do that thing 18 months. Do that now. Be ready for that now. So I think there's a lot of sense in that. Anticipate where your customers are probably going at the moment, but just look around, read the landscape, read the room, and say, this is going to be the way things are in about 18 or 24 months, and be prepared for that. Harvey Pitt, a former SEC chairman who was a columnist I dealt with at Compliance Week, he used to say that sooner or later, even the inevitable will happen, and you should not be surprised by that. But too many people are, and that's probably the best advice. Whether it was Harvey Pitt or my old editor Rod Doherty, who was saying, think about what readers will want 2 years from now, be able to deliver that. Like, it's that sort of thing. See where the puck is going to be. That's it. That's my last analogy. I don't even watch hockey, but go to where.
Well, as a Blackhawks fan who now lives in Detroit, the Gretzky analogy is absolutely appreciated.
All right.
And we do have a couple other comments in the chat, but unfortunately, I think we've run out of time today. I think this is a sign that, Matt, we need to have you come back at some point in time, because you are a wealth of information. I love having these conversations about the future of the profession, and also just talking about the humanness, the humanity that exists within these professions as they continue to converge and move in different ways to meet the needs of business 18 months from now.
Well, certainly anybody who had questions that we didn't get to answer, if you want to email me or track me down, I'm happy to talk with you some other time. But it's been a pleasure and a lot of fun here talking with you both. So I'd be happy to come back sometime next year when the time's right. But this has been great. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Matt.
And thanks everyone for joining us.